as Marta has mentioned already, I'm going to talk to you about today about health inequalities, risk behaviors, and adaptive functioning difficulties experienced by autistic people in that particular phase of life during transition to adulthood. So just to give you a brief overview of the presentation, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the concept of transition to adulthood, what it means and what the main terms around it are in literature. And then I'll move on to talk about a small-scale study that I'd done a number of years ago now that was looking at perceptions of transition to adulthood, and I'll explore a little bit adaptive functioning and sensory difficulties during that phase of life, and also risk behaviors that people with autism tend to engage in during that transition to adulthood. And then I'll move on to some more recent work that I've done, which includes using large-scale health and administrative data records that are available through either health services and social work services. And just to finish up, I'll conclude the main points from my research to date, and I'll very briefly talk about some next steps and projects in progress. So without any further ado, let's jump in. So I'll first start by discussing what main perspective is often used in literature, in research, to talk about transitions in general. So there's a concept that's called life course perspective, which is a stage-like approach to talking about different types of transitions that we go through in our lives, because it proposes that each person can experience a number of different transitions or changes in roles and statuses that represent distinct departure from any previous activities or roles or statuses in our lives that we may have been involved in. And there's a concept of objective demographic markers that is used often to describe different transitions that we go through. And those objective demographic markers basically mean the main events that we might go through in our lives, the main stages that we might or main phases of how our life develops. And these can include events like leaving school, getting a first or a new job, starting university, getting married, getting divorced, etc. And here you can see that I've included different objective demographic markers, different events that can happen at very different stages in life, different ages of one's life trajectory. But today I'm going to focus on transition to adulthood in particular. And that's because I think it's an especially important developmental period in anyone's life, but also particularly in autistic people's lives, as it sets up a trajectory of adult functioning for the rest of our lives. And it's a period, I think, that is characterized often by very different, very heterogeneous developmental trajectories. So our lives develop in very different ways. And the period of transition to adulthood often occurs between the ages of 18 to 25, and that period tends to be branded in literature as so-called emerging adulthood, where individuals are engaged in that process of prolonged self-exploration. So young people want to find out who they are as people, so that can form their identity in later stages of lives. But for people with autism, that period of emerging adulthood can last well into midlife, from what I've seen in my research and from what I observe from other people's research and literature in that field. And reasons for that prolonged period of emerging adulthood and different challenges throughout that transition can be very different. And I'm going to talk about some of those challenges today. So some of the most common patterns in transition to adulthood for autistic people include a loss of services during that move from children to adult services, and that can complicate that process even further. And at the moment, literature says that there's an association between early diagnosis and start of treatment, post-diagnosis, and better long-term outcomes, such as improvements in IQ or adaptive behavior for autistic people. But the reality often is that that process of diagnosis is delayed for many autistic adults, and that seems to be particularly the case for girls and women, or children who come from racial or ethnic minorities and lower income families, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And of course, the fact that somebody's diagnosis is delayed can often mean that they have a decreased access to health-related services as a result of that. And that can lead to challenges with adjustments to new settings and roles that do come up during that transition to adulthood, which then can lead to further complexities and difficulties with adapting to new environments and new roles that we are often expected to take on as adults. And of course, as I mentioned before, this may continue well into adulthood, but very few studies have examined those service disparities, service differences over the whole life course for people with autism, including older age. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to talk first of all about a small qualitative study that I had done exploring perceptions of transition to adulthood among adults with autism. And we talked about things like how they understand the process of transition to adulthood, what it means to them, how available or non-available actually service provision can impact that process, and how they can relate to those so-called objective demographic markers, whether they actually have any importance to them in their own transition to adulthood. So the study included collecting data through semi-structured interviews, and I interviewed adults with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism, as well as professionals working with those adults. And I also had done a couple of focus group interviews with parents of adults who were on the spectrum. But today I'm mostly going to focus on the data that I collected from autistic adults themselves. And the group that was involved in this study included 12 autistic adults who were and 11 of those 12 adults were diagnosed with autism in adolescence or adulthood, some of them in late 20s or 30s, so rather late on in life. And 8 of those 12 adults were also diagnosed or sometimes even misdiagnosed with mental health problems before they obtained a diagnosis of autism. And adults talked about mental health problems being associated with risk behaviors such as self-harming or attempted suicide. And that often meant that those accounts were rather distressing to hear for me as a researcher, but you'll see that for yourself in a minute. So one of the main themes that came up in the data were daily transitions in emerging adulthood. And daily transitions are those transient points between everyday activities that we do on a regular basis and different physical environments and social contexts that we have to operate in, such as work, school, or social life. And during the transition to adulthood, we all take on greater or sole responsibility for various daily activities, such as preparing our own meals or getting ready for the day, getting ready for work, etc. But for autistic adults, there might be difficulties in coping with unexpected changes in routine or physical, social, or sensory environments. And that means that they can also have difficulties with those daily transitions. But there's currently lack of evidence presenting first-hand accounts of adaptive functioning difficulties that adolescents or adults with autism can experience. So since I've mentioned adaptive functioning difficulties, let's discuss what those adaptive functioning difficulties are, what that term actually means. So adaptive behaviors or adaptive functioning skills are a very broad, is a term that is used to describe a very broad concept which talks about behaviors that are necessary for age-appropriate independent functioning in social, communication, daily living or motor areas. And these behaviors are defined by typical performance rather than ability, meaning that they can still be lowered even when cognitive or intellectual functioning is average, making it necessary to separately address adaptive skills in interventions for autistic people who often, of course, have average or high or above average intelligence. And in literature, in previous research, strong adaptive functioning skills are associated with optimal outcomes for autistic adults. But research also talks about the fact that there is a negative correlation between age and adaptive functioning. And what does that mean in practice? Well, autistic adults score well on daily living skills, such as meal preparation, compared to communication and social skills. But there is no difference in adolescents, who of course represent a younger group here. But daily living skills continue to develop post-adolescent stage. So they can be still developed later on in life, but the development of age-appropriate communication and social skills and improvement in symptoms and behaviors that are related to somebody's autism, that appears to slow with age. So there's a difference there. And researchers think that that might be correlated with the fact that in many autistic people's trajectories, there's that loss of access to services once they move from children to adult services. But of course, there's very little research on that. So now let's move on to what my own data was saying about those adaptive functioning skills and daily transitions in autistic adults' everyday lives. So one of the themes that came up really strongly in the data was the importance of having a daily routine. And here, Robert, 34, at the time when I spoke to him, is talking about his daily routine and how sometimes it can be difficult to develop one. So Robert said, not a lot of students can say that they have the problems which I have in forming a kind of functional routine, or the problems I have in doing the things that I need to do to live an ordinary life. These things are still with me and I've not had help with them. Things like making sure I've always got clean clothes and the right clean clothes. It's just the mainstay things. Having meals on time is something quite difficult as well, but I've developed a routine, a system for eating. When I was doing my volunteer jobs, I had a very orderly diet. I had the same thing every day, basically. A breakfast of cold porridge and bananas, a lunch of bulgur wheat and salad, and a dinner of bulgur wheat and salad. And I was having 3 meals a day. I could make all of these meals up within a couple of minutes. There's only 1 or 2 ingredients, so I don't start getting anxious because I'm mixing too many things together. And I'm fed and it's nutritious. And also sleeping is always a problem. It's a big problem for me. I can be doing everything right, eating at the right time, getting up, doing something during the day, and still have nights where I only get 1 or 2 hours of sleep. The routine is something I don't have at the moment, but want to get. So you can see here how he's describing different difficulties that he's experiencing in these quite simple everyday tasks that he has to perform to take care of himself. And here, one of the parents also described the difficulty with establishing a sustainable routine. And he talks about his son. And Simon says, he works very strange hours. It's quite a solitary job. It's very solitary. He doesn't go to work until 12 o'clock and he works until 8. He doesn't go to bed until 3. I suspect the place is full of people who are like him and who are smart and focused. He's very smart. I'd imagine it's a very structured environment. I think basically he's given a job, he does it, and someone else checks it, or he checks somebody else. It's done like that. It's not really them working together, as far as I understand. It's not interpersonal relations. So here Simon talks a little bit about the routine and the uniqueness of that routine as well, but also the fact that it helps to maintain it when there's no real interpersonal functioning element to it, because that can be quite difficult for people on the autism spectrum. And the other theme that autistic adults discussed when talking about those daily transitions were sensory difficulties. So managing one's sensory environment was quite difficult in how they were able to perform different daily tasks. And here you can see a conversation between Owen, who's on the autism spectrum, and his wife, Rebecca. And I asked, did you suspect Owen might be on the spectrum before he actually got the diagnosis? No, we never did, because that's really interesting. I was quite interested post-diagnosis in the things he started telling me about, like daily emotional anxiety, sensory experience. I had no idea. I mean, he may have mentioned some things like, oh, her face looks funny on the TV. Now, I didn't realize it meant her face to him was like, and then Owen chips in, I see it as a decoupage, as I see it like stacked wrongly on top of each other. And Rebecca added, I didn't realize that it was what it was. And then Owen said, maybe I wouldn't say anything to you because you don't wear too much makeup. When someone wears a lot of makeup, I would just see the layers of makeup, just a mask. So yeah, I would see layers separately and together, like a clown. And then Owen goes on to describe those difficulties, sensory difficulties, in a little bit more detail. I'm realizing my senses kind of being a little bit different, like hearing movement, feeling sound. I can feel sound. I didn't realize that that was different before. Sometimes I have total sensory overlap. It could be light, it could be sound, it could be touch. One of my senses would just become so heightened, it'll be as if I'm sitting right in the middle of a hurricane. Myself and Rebecca could be downstairs and we could just be chatting, and all the different types of noise become a hurricane, and it's just immense and fast, and sights can be too much as well. I can see too much, everything just rushes in, a huge creating tilt. Sometimes I get a ton of motion where I start drawing massive circles, I think he said over there, getting bigger and bigger. I start feeling it on my skin. I can feel that bigger and bigger, and it's all consuming, and it's just all my senses going wild. And you can see how that would disrupt somebody's daily routine and the tasks, everyday tasks they are trying to perform, or the shifts they have to make between different sensory environments or physical environments they have to function in on a day-to-day basis. And the other theme that was often discussed during the interviews were risk behaviors in emerging adulthood. And risk behaviors are those types of behaviors that increase the likelihood of a negative health outcome, either right now or in the future. And they can include things like excessive alcohol or drug use, or self-harming, for example. And there is really a substantial body of research on those types of behaviors in adolescents, in general population without autism, but there is really very little comparatively in relation to risk behaviors in people with disabilities in general, let alone people with autism. And normally, during transition to adulthood, aspiration for security and stability would be mediated by the desire not to limit spontaneity. So that means that people with young people who are in that transition to adulthood want to explore their environments, they want to explore who they are as a person, so they want to take risks and be adventurous and experiment more in that period of life, but that can create a very fertile ground for developing risk behaviors. And literature on the general population shows that difficulties with social communication and interaction can lead to social isolation and feelings of self-rejection. and also lack of awareness and understanding of social norms can result in lower self-esteem or in seeking social approvals from high-risk groups, deviant groups. And both of these factors are linked with predisposition to risk behaviors in general population studies, but there haven't been any studies on autistic population. And given that people with autism do experience social communication and interaction difficulties and can have a lower understanding of social norms, it's really of high importance that those studies are conducted also on autistic populations. So let's talk about how people with autism describe those risk behaviors in the study that I had done. So autistic adults talked about developing coping mechanisms, or what they thought were coping mechanisms. And here Nicole, 40 at the time, was saying, basically, I ended up with what I thought of as coping mechanisms, but they weren't. They were coping failures, really. I was very dependent on alcohol. I learned early on that it made life less frightening. I was very promiscuous, basically because autistic people do what they are told. There were a lot of people that took advantage of that. I had fallen into a pattern of behavior where I only knew one way of being nice to men, and that was to say yes to sex. I didn't understand the concept of saying no. I was self-harming a lot, all sorts of ways that I had destructive behaviors, which had developed initially as ways of coping, but none of them were sustainable ways of coping. What the antidepressants did, which she took when she was in early 20s, was that they basically gave me a bit of solid ground to stand on, so that over a period of many years, I could systematically tackle some of these issues. And also another autistic adult explained some of the coping mechanisms that he was trying to develop to deal with suicidality. And Thomas, 22 at the time, said, oh, a couple of weeks ago, I was about 3.5 weeks through abstaining from watching DVDs for 4 weeks. As it turns out, I often watch a DVD when I'm feeling suicidal. So the fact that I cut that off meant that the suicidal thoughts were able to develop. I'm suicidal on irregular evenings. That's normal for me this year, and it's a big improvement from last year. It's also fairly sustainable because if I want to hang myself properly, I need to buy a rope during the daytime since that's when the shops are open. And I'm very rarely suicidal during the daytime, so it doesn't really matter if I'm suicidal on irregular evenings. Of course, once I realized that DVDs help stop me from getting too suicidal, I let myself watch them again. Unfortunately, I did a bit more research on suicide shortly before I realized what the problem was. And it was then that I found out a way of hanging myself fairly painlessly in my bedroom without needing to buy a rope from a shop. This is very bad because all of my coping mechanisms and everything I've done to keep myself alive has just been about enough for the previous state of affairs when I couldn't kill myself on impulse. So I'm not mentally any worse than I usually am, but I'm potentially in a lot more danger of death now. So you can see here what the heightened logic in which he's explaining these very distressing and emotional concepts, which to him really are the basis for survival. And mental health were often discussed in relation to risk behaviors that people, autistic people were engaging in. And here you can see a conversation between a daughter and a father. And Mary said, I went into myself and stopped being very sociable. I kind of thought to myself, there's no point. I would have preferred to play with people, but I've never had the confidence much again. And then Neil, her father, said, also, she was carrying a bit of weight at the time, and once she started secondary school, and Mary chipped in, I developed an eating disorder and grew very depressed, and it's kind of the side effects of Asperger's that I realized that I had something. And Neil added, she started self-harming as well. It was either strangling or stealing our painkillers because my wife's on various painkillers. So here you can see how risk behaviors and mental health are very much intertwined in this population. And just one last quote from Robert, who said, I had a bit of a crisis and I crashed. I was drinking a lot and spending a lot of my money. By about the middle of November, during the academic year, I'd spent all of my university grant money for that academic year, and I was still on antidepressants, but I hadn't taken them for several days, and I was feeling really strange. I wanted some kind of help, emergency help. I went up to the A&E near me and I said, I've had enough. I just want to go somewhere and get away from it. And I thought at the time, if I do something criminal, then they'll have to deal with it. So I smashed the window up at the hospital. I checked. I checked, no one was inside, and they waited and the police came. And a few days after that, I called the person who sent me for diagnosis and he saw me straight away. But there was nothing, as far as I know, at the time in terms of services back then. So here you can see how those risk behaviors are often just a cry for help, a very desperate attempt to receive some services. And in Robert's case, it was an attempt to actually get a diagnosis. So speaking of health, now I'm going to move on to a couple of more recent projects, and they are on a much larger scale. So the first project used a data that was collected through Scotland's census back in 2011, and the Scottish census is held every 10 years by the National Records of Scotland, and it's a snapshot of all people in Scotland on one night. And the census from 2011 was held on the 27th of March back in 2011. And in the data set, autism was self or proxy reported, meaning that autistic people could report themselves that they had autism, or parents or family members could report on their behalf. But a diagnosis, a clinical diagnosis, was not necessary to be recorded as having autism. And the census had a very high response rate of 94%, and the remaining 6% of the population was imputed, meaning that the data were made up for those 6% that were missing, but it was done in a very systematic and rigorous statistical way. And in the census, for the very first time in 2011, there was a question about general health status. So people were able to rate their own health or rate health of their family members in their household. And they were given a five-point scale to rate the health on, including very good, good, fair, bad, and very bad health. And in order to analyze the data, we combined the categories of fair, bad, and very bad health into poor health. And I'll show you briefly the kind of the overview of the whole population that was captured in the census. So there were over 5 million people living in Scotland on the night when the census was conducted. And in the group of children and young people who were aged 0 to 24 years old, 1.6% of them had autism. And within that group, the vast majority were males. So the vast majority of children and young people were boys. Children and young people who had autism, of course. And in the adult population, 0.2% of adults aged 25 and over had autism. And again, autism was much more common in men than in women. And now I'm going to show you some graphs that talk about findings on that general health status question and discuss that transitional period in particular. So this first graph is talking about the general health status in the population of young people aged 16 to 24. So that's specifically that transition to adulthood. And here, gray is for everybody, orange is for girls, and boys, blue is for boys. And on the left-hand side, you've got a graph that's presenting health of young people with autism, and on the right-hand side, you've got health of young people without autism. And you can see that in the population with autism, on the left-hand side, young people were much more likely to rate their health as poor, so either fair, bad, or very bad. compared to the population without autism. And if you look at the orange bars, those are for girls. Girls were more likely to have poorer health than boys. And that goes for comparison with between girls with and without autism, but also when comparing to boys with and without autism. So girls with autism were the most likely to rate their health as poor in the whole population within that age group, of course. And this next graph is showing you the findings for the rest of the adult population. So that's ages 25 plus. And again, gray is for everybody, orange is for women, and blue is for men. And again, in the population with autism, adults were more likely to rate their health as poor, so either fair, bad, or very bad. But the ratings are maybe more evenly distributed across the 5 different response options. But again, if you look at the orange bars, that's for women with autism, they were the most likely to rate their health as poor again, compared to women without autism and also men with and without autism. Since that is the case, the next 2 graphs explore a little bit more the ratings for girls specifically. So here, this graph is showing you proportion of girls with and without autism reporting poor health by age. And here, orange is for girls without autism and blue is for girls with autism. And you can see that girls with autism in both age groups, so 0 to 15-year-olds and 16 to 24-year-olds, were much more likely to rate their health as poor, so fair, bad, or very bad. And that's particularly the case in that transition period for 16 to 24-year-olds. And when we look at the population of all adults, ages 25 and over, that's again the case. So again, the blue bars are for women with autism, and you can see that in all of the age groups, starting with 25 to 34-year-olds and ending with 65 and over, women with autism were much more likely to rate their health as poor. So the data from Scottish Census is clearly showing us that health is poorer for girls and women of all ages. And these findings and other findings from the census work that we've done as part of the Observatory work are published, have been published in a number of articles. And here's a list of some of them, not all of them. I don't think I've included all of them, but if you want to follow up, you can have a look at the references. And this list includes papers on autism, but also on the population with intellectual disabilities. And the second study I wanted to discuss today that also talks about health of autistic youth during the transition to adulthood is using data that was collected as part of the National Longitudinal Transitions Study 2. And it's a national picture of the experiences and achievements of American students, United States students, who are in special education during high school and transition to adult life. And this data set presents a range of educational, vocational, social, and personal experiences. So there is a whole range of different variables in the data set. And it's a nationally representative sample of 13 to 17-year-olds receiving special education services. And the dataset covers a period from December 2000, when the first wave of data collection was collected, when the study began, and followed until 2009, and that was wave 5 when the study ended. And this next slide shows you the 5 waves of data collections that happened during the study and the school years when the data were collected for each of those waves and the age ranges that the students were at during those waves of data collection. And you can see that the age range very much covered that period of transition to adulthood. And in the data set, there was a question that asked parents with what physical, sensory, learning or other disabilities or problems has youth been diagnosed. And here there was a range of response options that parents were able to choose from. And we used the Autism or Asperger's response option to identify young people with autism. And we also then used two other response options of Down syndrome and mental retardation, which means intellectual disabilities, but it's mental retardation is still the term that is very often used in the US. And we used those two response options to identify how many of young people with autism also had additional co-occurring intellectual disabilities. And this next table shows you the findings. So across the 5 waves of data collection, there was a fairly constant, steady proportion of youth with autism, starting with 11.3% at wave 1 and ending with 13.7% at wave 5. And within the group of young people with autism, 13.1% of them had additional intellectual disabilities at wave 1, and 12.5% had additional intellectual disabilities at wave 5. And you can also see that as the waves of data collection progress across time, there was a dropout rate in the data set, but that is to be expected with any longitudinal studies that are done on such a large scale. And in this data set, there was a question that also asked parents to rate general health of autistic youth. And again, similarly to the census, the Scottish census study, there was a 5-point scale that parents were able to rate their children's health on. And the response options included excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor health. And in this next graph, you can see how parents rated their children's health across the 5 waves of data collection. So here, the top line is for excellent health, then the line below that is for very good, good, fair, and poor health. And you can see that if you look at the last 2 bottom lines for fair and poor health, you can see that the proportion of autistic youth who had their health rated by their parents as fair or poor was fairly high for the whole group, but also fairly constant across the transitional period, across the 5 waves of data collection, meaning that the health wasn't necessarily getting so much worse across time with age. But if you look at excellent health, you can, so that's the top line, you can see that was declining with age, but then there was an increase in the proportion of how many young people had very good health. So you can see a bit of a swap there between trends of in excellent and very good health. And to summarize the findings from that study, as I mentioned, the proportion of youth with autism who were reported to have excellent health appeared to decline over time overall, and separately for those with and without additional intellectual disabilities, which I didn't present in the graph in the interest of time. But longitudinally, that measure of general health status did not seem to decline over that transitional period, and there was no gradient of wave of data collection being associated with how parents rated their children's general health status across that 10-year period when the study was conducted. And something that I haven't presented here in the graphs or in the tables was that youth with autism had worse health if they also had intellectual disabilities and or had lower household income, because we also looked at income that was reported for the families who took part in the study. But we have found, when we looked at other variables, we have found that there was no difference with regard to sex, ethnicity, or parental relationship status. So those variables were not associated with poorer health in autistic people, interestingly, especially given the findings from the study which I talked about that looked at the Scottish census data, where girls and women were more prone to experiencing poorer health. We did not find that in this cohort. And we have published one paper from this study, but it looks at the population with intellectual disabilities with and without Down syndrome. The findings that I have presented to you here today on the group with autism specifically are still under review, so I'm not able to share a reference for that particular paper. But I'll just briefly talk about one more paper which you might want to have a look at. It didn't focus specifically on that transitional period that we are discussing today, but it did look at physical health, which we haven't really investigated in any of the studies that I have discussed before today. So we looked at mental health and the qualitative data that I was talking about earlier on. Then we looked at general health status in the two large-scale studies that I mentioned, but we haven't really explored physical health yet in our work in the observatory, but we have done a systematic review of systematic reviews and meta-analyses of existing studies that other academics have published. So it's an overview of what's been done already in that area of research in autism. And we have found that there had been 24 systematic reviews published to date. And again, they looked at all developmental stages and ages. So 15 of them looked at children, 1 of them looked at adults, and 8 of them looked at both children and adults. So that suggests that there's still a gap in terms of more research being needed on adults, how physical health looks for adults who are on the autism spectrum. And in that systematic review, we did find that some conditions, some physical health conditions, were more prevalent in people with autism than in the rest of the populations. And that included conditions like sleep problems, epilepsy, sensory impairments, incontinence, different types of allergies, autoimmune disorders, and obesity. There was not enough evidence to draw any firm conclusions on conditions like asthma or type 2 diabetes, which is developed later on in life, but that might be also because there have been so few systematic reviews that have been published on adults specifically. And evidence on other conditions was just not sufficient or consistent enough to draw any conclusions at all, actually. And we have also found that there have been no systematic reviews done previously that would look at comorbidity, that is 2 different conditions co-occurring together, or multimorbidity, which is multiple different conditions co-occurring together overall. So there are no papers that look at that concept much more broadly. There are just systematic reviews that look at specific conditions. And we have also not found any systematic reviews that would have investigated cardiovascular conditions, cancers, neurological conditions, apart from epilepsy, and musculoskeletal conditions. And that's really, I think, surprising and also worrying a little bit, because especially given that cardiovascular and conditions and cancers are one of the major causes of death in the general population. So we would want to know more about whether those conditions are more prevalent in autistic adults, and whether they are also more likely to die of those conditions, also to experience premature mortality due to those causes. So just to conclude briefly, what we've spoken about today is that sensory difficulties can lead to increased levels of anxiety and a range of challenges with social interactions during the transition to adulthood, which can add to that complexity of developing those adaptive behaviors that are necessary to perform those different roles that we take on in our adult lives and function as an independent adult. And possibly reduction or loss of stimulating settings or services in that move from children to adult services can have a lasting impact on general health of autistic people, as well as family life and relationships, and that may truncate further that developmental trajectory of age-appropriate adaptive functioning skills that autistic adults need to develop in order to be able to function independently. We also spoke about the fact that lack of understanding of social norms and the desire to fit in rather than thrill-seeking and succumbing to social pressure to socialize can lead to problems with substance abuse or poor mental health. So there's a difference there between how those trends of undertaking or engaging in risk behaviors looks like in the general population versus the population with autism. So lack of understanding of social norms and the desire to fit in is something that is seems to be driving autistic people more to seeking, to engaging in risk behaviors. We also spoke about the fact that autistic adults of all ages are more likely to rate their health as worse than in the general population, and that seems to be particularly the case for girls and women. And based on the second larger scale study that I have discussed today from the longitudinal data, we also know that autistic youth has worse health if they also have intellectual disabilities and or come from lower income households. But there seems to be an uneven developmental profile of people with autism, and that can make it increasingly difficult for service providers to evaluate what those support needs might be during that transition to adulthood period. And that seems to be particularly the case in autistic girls and women, for whom we have less, on whom we have less research on, and about whom we know far less than we know about men with autism. And in terms of, very quickly, in terms of some next steps and projects in progress that I'm working on at the moment, there are two big data linkage studies that I'm involved in. And one of them is looking at suicide attempts and deaths, and is actually attempting to investigate mental health problems and substance abuse as predictors of suicide. So that goes back to that point I was making about risk behaviors earlier on today, and whether there's a link there between, very much a close link between risk behaviors and mental health, and how that can impact mortality. And the other study, the other large-scale study that I'm currently involved in and leading on is also looking to investigate the effect of intellectual disabilities on mortality in autistic people. So that goes back to that point that I was making about the fact that autistic youth seems to experience poorer health if they also have co-occurring intellectual disabilities. But what we do not know so far is whether that also can lead to higher mortality. So whether that poor health then can turn into higher mortality rates in that population. And I'm also working with a couple of students who are doing smaller scale qualitative studies, and one of them is looking at pathways in and out of homelessness. And here we're hoping to explore a little bit more how mental health and risk behaviors can be also risk factors into becoming homeless in the autistic population. And the second study is looking at mental health problems in the autistic population, and how autistic adults engage in therapy and how they build relationships when accessing services from their therapists, and whether that can improve both their experience of using those services, but also their mental health in the long run. So I'm going to finish here, especially that I'm out of time. And here are my contact details. If you want to follow up on any of these points, you can email me. You can also visit the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory website, where we have much more information on different projects that we have conducted to date. And you can find us on Twitter as well.